In the winter of 1987, Linda Farrell sat at her government-issue metal desk in a windowless office 3 floors below street level in the Internal Revenue Service building in Washington, D.C., working through what should have been a routine federal payroll audit. The fluorescent lights hummed their perpetual monotone. The air smelled of old coffee and photocopier toner. For 12 years, Farrell had processed these administrative reviews, cross-referencing contractor payments, verifying badge access logs, reconciling timesheets against facility entry records. It was methodical work, the kind that demanded attention to detail but rarely produced surprises. On this particular afternoon in early May, however, she noticed something that didn't fit. The discrepancy was small, almost dismissible, a billing entry for maintenance work at a defense logistics command facility that corresponded with no recorded entry at the security checkpoint. Ernst Bauer, a civilian contractor who repaired institutional clocks, had submitted invoices for work performed on 3 separate occasions in March. His timesheets indicated he had spent 4 hours inside the facility on each visit. But the badge scan database showed no record of anyone named Ernst Bauer passing through the main entrance on any of those dates. Farrell made a note in the margin of her report. She had seen administrative errors before missed swipes, malfunctioning readers, clerical oversights. But something about this particular discrepancy nagged at her professional instincts. She pulled Bauer's file from the contractor database and began a more thorough review. Ernst Bauer had been performing clock maintenance for various government facilities since 1974, when he had immigrated to the United States from Austria. His work was consistently satisfactory, his invoices always properly documented, his references impeccable. He operated a small repair shop in Silver Ridge, Maryland, specializing in institutional timepieces, the large mechanical clocks found in government buildings, schools, and hospitals. The business appeared entirely legitimate, unremarkable in every way. Yet here were 3 invoices claiming work that the security system had no record of him performing. Farrell flagged the discrepancy for secondary review and forwarded her findings to the Defense Logistics Command's Internal Security Office. She returned to her other cases, assuming someone would contact Bauer about updating his access procedures or correcting the badge scan records. She had no way of knowing that her routine administrative notation had just identified the first visible crack in an espionage operation that had been running undetected for 13 years. The internal security memo reached FBI counterintelligence agent Daniel Mercer's desk on June 2, 1987. Mercer had spent 16 years investigating Soviet intelligence operations in the Washington metropolitan area, and he had developed an instinct for the patterns that separated innocent administrative confusion from something more deliberate. He read Farrell's report twice, then pulled the complete access logs for the Defense Logistics Command facility for the previous 6 months. What he found in those logs transformed a minor billing irregularity into something far more troubling. Ernst Bauer's name appeared in the facility's visitor management system 47 times over the past year. But when Mercer cross-referenced those entries against the actual badge scan data from the facility's electronic access control system, a newer, more sophisticated tracking mechanism that had been installed only 8 months earlier, the pattern fractured. On 17 occasions, someone using Ernst Bauer's credentials had entered the facility when the visitor log showed no scheduled appointment. On 11 occasions, Bauer had been logged into 2 separate buildings simultaneously. On 3 occasions, badge scans showed Bauer moving through secured corridors at speeds that would have required him to run continuously for distances exceeding a quarter mile. The data suggested an impossible conclusion. Ernst Bauer was appearing in multiple locations at the same time. Mercer brought the case to his supervisor, who authorized a preliminary investigation. They began with the most obvious hypothesis, that Bauer's security credentials had been cloned or stolen. But when they examined the photographic records from the facility's surveillance cameras, they found something far stranger. The cameras showed a man matching Bauer's general description, middle-aged, average height, brown hair graying at the temples, wearing the standard contractor's uniform of dark slacks and a light blue work shirt. But when analysts placed the photographs side by side and examined them using newly developed digital comparison techniques, subtle differences emerged. The man in the March 14th footage had a slightly broader jawline. The man photographed on April 3rd held his shoulders differently, with a barely perceptible forward cant. The gait analysis, a technique the FBI had recently adopted from biomechanics. Research showed variations in step cadence of approximately 11%. The shoulder sway differed significantly. Two different men were using the same identity, wearing similar clothing, carrying identical maintenance equipment, and presenting themselves as Ernst Bauer at different times. The implications were immediately clear to Mercer. This was not a case of stolen credentials or administrative error. This was a sophisticated illegal operation, the kind of deep cover espionage that the KGB had been perfecting since the 1950s, somewhere in the Washington area. At least two Soviet intelligence officers were sharing a single legend, rotating through the same identity to create the illusion of a single, harmless clock repairman, while systematically infiltrating one of the most sensitive logistics facilities in the American defense infrastructure. The investigation expanded. Mercer assembled a task force that included FBI surveillance specialists, NC signals intelligence analysts, and counterintelligence officers from the Defense Intelligence Agency. They needed to identify both individuals, determine their handlers, map their network, and understand the full scope of what had been compromised. But they had to do so without alerting the targets that they had been discovered. Any premature move would cause the illegals to vanish, their handlers to shut down the network, and the damage assessment to remain forever incomplete. The surveillance began in early July 1987. Teams established observation posts with clear lines of sight to Bauer's clock repair shop in Silver, Rizha modest storefront on a quiet commercial street lined with small businesses, sandwich shops, and dry cleaners. The shop occupied the ground floor of a two-story brick building constructed in the early 1960s. Large windows displayed antique clocks in various states of repair. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Bauer Clock and Watch Repair since 1974. The interior was visible from the street. Workbenches cluttered with gears and springs. Walls lined with timepieces. A small office area in the back. It looked exactly like what it claimed to be. For 3 weeks, surveillance teams photographed everyone who entered or exited the shop. They documented the man who opened the store each morning at 9 o'clock and closed it each evening at 6. They cataloged his routines, the lunch breaks, the supply runs, the evening walks to a nearby diner. They tracked his vehicle, a 12-year-old Dodge sedan registered to Ernst Bauer at an address in Silver Ridge. The man they observed matched the description from immigration records. 53 years old, Austrian national, naturalized U.S. citizen. No criminal record, no known political affiliations. He lived alone in a modest apartment above the shop. He attended no church, belonged to no clubs, maintained no visible social circle beyond polite interactions with neighboring shopkeepers. His life appeared deliberately unremarkable, almost aggressively ordinary. But on August 12th, surveillance cameras captured something that shattered the carefully constructed normalcy. At 2:47 in the afternoon, while the man identified as Ernst Bauer was clearly visible through the shop window working at his bench, badge access records showed that Ernst Bauer had just entered the Defense Logistics Command facility 9 miles away in Reston, Virginia. One man was in the shop. Another man was presenting Bauer's credentials at a secure government installation. The two-person operation was confirmed. The FBI now faced a more complex question. Who was the second man, and how was the substitution being coordinated? They expanded surveillance to include everyone who visited the shop. Analysts reviewed 3 months of footage, frame by frame, looking for patterns. They found it in late August. Approximately once every 2 weeks, a customer would enter the shop carrying a clock for repair, a common occurrence that drew no particular attention. But when analysts examined the pattern more closely, they noticed that these particular customers always arrived on federal holidays or during inclement weather days when government facilities operated on reduced schedules and security procedures were more relaxed. The customer would remain in the shop for 15 to 20 minutes, longer than typical drop-off visits. And in the days immediately following these visits, the badge access discrepancies at the Defense Logistics Command facility would spike. Someone was entering the shop, conferring with the primary operator, and then using the Bauer identity to conduct infiltration operations while the shopkeeper maintained the public facade. The two men were coordinating their activities through these brief, seemingly innocent interactions. By September, the FBI had identified the second operative. Enhanced photographic analysis and gait comparison confirmed that the infiltrator bore a strong familial resemblance to the shopkeeper, likely a brother, sharing enough physical characteristics to make the impersonation plausible under casual observation. Intelligence analysts cross-referenced Soviet diplomatic personnel files, KGB defector testimony, and CIA records of known illegals programs. A probable match emerged: Leonid and Sergei Markov, brothers from a KGB illegals program who had been inserted into Western Europe in the early 1970s and had subsequently disappeared from all known intelligence tracking. The brothers had acquired the identity of a real Austrian citizen named Ernst Bauer, man who had emigrated from Vienna in the 1960s and never returned, creating a perfect legend with genuine documentation and no risk of family contradiction. Leonid had assumed the primary identity, operating the clock repair business and building the legitimate cover. Sergei functioned as the operational twin, using the same credentials to gain access to secure facilities, while Leonid maintained the public presence. It was an elegant system, designed to create alibi and plausible deniability through the simple fact of appearing to be in two places at once. The technical sophistication of the operation became apparent as the investigation deepened. In October, NSA signals intelligence analysts monitoring Soviet embassy communications detected anomalous radio transmissions originating from the Reston area brief. Precisely timed bursts of encrypted data lasting less than 40 milliseconds, using a frequency hopping pattern that made interception and tracking extremely difficult. The transmissions occurred on an irregular schedule, always late at night, always from locations within a 3-mile radius of the shop. The NSA had recently deployed new algorithm upgrades designed to detect exactly this kind of covert communication method, experimental technology that the KGB likely did not know the Americans possessed. Analysts triangulated the source to a safe house in Reston, Virginia, registered under a shell company that had existed for less than 2 years. Surveillance of the safe house revealed that Sergei used it as a staging area, a place to change clothes, review operational materials, and transmit intelligence back to his handlers. Inside that safe house, investigators would later discover, was a modified metronome that served as the transmission device. The metronome's casing concealed a miniaturized radio transmitter capable of sending compressed data bursts using frequency-hopping spread spectrum technology. It was a remarkable piece of engineering, far more sophisticated than the traditional shortwave sets used by earlier generations of Soviet illegals. The FBI now understood the mechanics of the operation. But they still needed to identify the handlers and understand what intelligence was being collected. The Defense Logistics Command Facility was not a high-profile target like the Pentagon or CIA headquarters, but its sensitivity was considerable. The facility coordinated logistics routing for military supplies, managed transportation networks for sensitive materials, and maintained databases on troop mobility and rapid deployment capabilities. An illegal with regular access to the facility's corridors. Observation of personnel routines, knowledge of security procedures, and even casual glimpses of file labels or overheard conversations could provide the KGB with invaluable intelligence about American military readiness. During a period when Cold War tensions remained high, when NATO and NATO, Warsaw Pact forces maintained hair-trigger, alert status along the German border, this kind of infrastructure. Intelligence could prove decisive in a crisis scenario. Knowing which supply routes were vulnerable, which communication nodes were critical, which personnel had access to what information, these details could enable sabotage, misdirection, or paralysis at exactly the moment when swift response was most critical. The stakes were enormous, and the operation had been running undetected for over a decade. In November 1987, the FBI identified the probable handler. Viktor Semyonov held an official position as a press assistant at the Soviet Embassy on Wisconsin Avenue, but his diplomatic cover was transparently thin. He had no background in journalism, maintained no media contacts, and produced no press releases or public statements. Counterintelligence files identified him as a suspected KGB officer assigned to illegals management. Surveillance. Teams observed Semyonov's movements throughout the fall, tracking his routine and watching for contacts with the Markov brothers. What they found was another layer of tradecraft sophistication. Semyonov never visited the clock shop. He never approached either brother directly. Instead, he maintained contact through a Soviet embassy staffer who volunteered as a pianist for a local church choir. The pianist attended choir practice every Thursday evening at a church less than 2 blocks from Bauer's shop. After practice, he would walk past the shop on his way to the metro station. If a specific decorative brass nail in the shop's window frame was turned 45 degrees clockwise, it signaled that intelligence was ready for collection. The pianist would return after midnight, retrieve a tightly rolled microfilm from the hollow interior of the nail, and pass it to Semyonov during a scheduled diplomatic reception or cultural event where casual physical contact was normal and surveillance was difficult. The signal nail system was simple, elegant, and nearly impossible to detect without already knowing what to look for. By December, the FBI had assembled a comprehensive picture of the operation. They had identified both illegals, located the safe house, intercepted communications, identified the handler, and documented the collection method. The decision to move forward with arrests came in early January 1988, driven by 2 factors. First, the investigation had reached the point of diminishing returns. Continued surveillance was unlikely to reveal additional network members or significantly enhance the damage assessment. Second, and more critically, the risk of the operation being compromised by accident or routine security upgrades was increasing. The Defense Logistics Command Facility was scheduled to implement biometric access controls, fingerprint and retinal scanning systems that would make the identity substitution impossible to sustain. Once those systems went live, the Markov brothers would either have to abandon the operation or attempt one final, potentially desperate intelligence collection that could endanger lives or national security. The FBI decided to act before that scenario could develop. The arrests occurred simultaneously at 6:12 a.m. on February 4, 1988. Tactical teams entered the clock shop and the Reston safe house with synchronized precision, minimizing the opportunity for either brother to destroy evidence or alert handlers. Leonid Markov was taken into custody in the apartment above the shop, still in his nightclothes, with no opportunity to resist or flee. Sergei was arrested in the safe house, where he had returned after a late-night transmission session. The raids yielded a trove of physical evidence that confirmed every element of the FBI's investigation and revealed details that surveillance had missed. Inside the clock shop, hidden behind a false panel in the office wall, agents discovered maps of the defense logistics, command facility with handwritten annotations in Russian marking security camera positions, guard rotation schedules, and restricted access corridors. They found coded notes detailing personnel movements and overheard conversations. They recovered the hollow signal nail and 3 microfilm cartridges that had not yet been collected, containing photographed documents and facility layouts. In the Reston safe house, they seized the modified metronome transmitter, encrypted communication protocols, and a collection of reversible jacket emblems that Sergei had used to impersonate civilian maintenance contractors. The emblems were masterfully crafted different company logos, printed on reversible fabric that could be flipped to match whatever contractor identity best suited the day's infiltration requirements. This simple technique had given Sergei casual legitimacy to wander corridors that would have been off-limits to visitors. Appearing as just another maintenance worker fixing a door latch or checking an electrical panel, the brothers were processed separately, held in isolation, and offered no information during initial interrogations. They were professionals, trained in resistance to questioning, prepared for the possibility of capture. But the physical evidence required no confession. The maps, the transmitter, the microfilm, the documented access logs, the case was airtight. In March 1988, both men were indicted under the Espionage Act on multiple counts of conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized access to classified facilities, and conspiracy to transmit national defense information to a foreign government. The trial was conducted under sealed proceedings in the Eastern District of Virginia, with most testimony heard in closed sessions under the Classified Information Procedures Act. The prosecution presented the technical evidence, methodically the badge access discrepancies, the photographic analysis, the intercepted transmissions, the physical materials seized during the raids. Defense attorneys argued that their clients had engaged in low-level information gathering that posed no actual threat to national security, that they had collected no classified documents, that they had merely observed and reported on publicly visible information. The argument failed to persuade the court. In December 1988, both Leonid and Sergei Markov were convicted on all counts and sentenced to 27 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. They were transferred to separate maximum security facilities with no communication permitted between them. For 2.5 years, they served their sentences in isolation from each other and from any contact with Soviet intelligence services. Then, in the summer of 1991, as the Soviet Union entered its final months of existence, the diplomatic calculus shifted. The Cold War was ending, not with dramatic confrontation, but with the slow-motion collapse of the communist bloc. The Warsaw Pact had dissolved, the Berlin Wall had fallen, and Soviet power was fragmenting into nationalist movements and economic chaos. In this context of geopolitical transformation, the fate of captured spies became a bargaining chip in the complex negotiations between Washington and Moscow. The United States had prisoners it wanted returned intelligence officers, diplomats, individuals held on various pretexts by Soviet authorities. The disintegrating Soviet government, desperate to extract whatever value remained from its intelligence networks, sought the return of its captured illegals. In July 1991, a prisoner exchange was negotiated. Leonid and Sergei Markov, along with 3 other convicted Soviet intelligence officers, were released from American custody and flown to Moscow in exchange for 7 individuals held by Soviet authorities. The exchange took place at a military airfield in Germany, the last such Cold War transaction before the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The Markov brothers returned to a country that was collapsing around them. Their years of careful work rendered moot by the very geopolitical forces they had once served. What happened to them after their return remains fragmentary and uncertain. Intelligence sources suggest that Leonid settled in Latvia after the Soviet dissolution, living quietly under his real name until his death in 2006 from heart failure. Sergei reportedly joined a private security firm operating in Eastern Europe, one of the many such companies that emerged in the post-Soviet chaos. Staffed by former intelligence officers seeking to monetize their skills in the new capitalist landscape. He vanished from public record by 2003, his fate unknown. Viktor Semyonov, the handler, was quietly expelled from the United States in 1988 on grounds of persona non grata, returning to Moscow before the arrests were made public. Linda Farrell, the IRS auditor whose routine paperwork had initiated the entire investigation, was never informed of the outcome. She continued her administrative work, processing payroll audits and reconciling contractor invoices, unaware that her notation in the margin of a report had unraveled a 13-year espionage operation. Daniel Mercer retired from the FBI in 1995, his role in the case remaining classified for years afterward. The Defense Logistics Command Facility upgraded its security systems, implemented biometric access controls, and revised its contractor vetting procedures. The hollow signal nail was placed in the National Cryptologic Museum's collection, a small brass artifact bearing no visible indication of the intelligence it had concealed. The full extent of what the Markov brothers compromised during their 13 years of operation remains classified. Damage assessments conducted after their arrest concluded that they had collected significant intelligence on logistics procedures, facility layouts, personnel routines, and security protocols information that could have proven valuable to Soviet military planning in the event of a NATO-Warsaw Pact confrontation. But they had not accessed classified documents or obtained technical specifications for weapon systems or communication networks. Their intelligence was observational, structural, procedural, the kind of information that is difficult to protect because it exists in the routines of daily operations, visible to anyone with patient eyes and regular access. This was the particular genius of the KGB's illegals program, the recognition that valuable intelligence did not always require dramatic document theft or recruitment of highly placed sources. Sometimes it required only the careful observation of ordinary patterns by patient men living unremarkable lives, slowly accumulating details that could be assembled into strategic understanding. For 13 years, two brothers had lived in the shadow of American power, one maintaining a clock shop while the other infiltrated the infrastructure, both playing a role written for them decades earlier by men in Moscow who understood that espionage was not always about dramatic confrontations, but about the slow, methodical exploitation of trust and routine. In the end, the story of the Markov brothers is not about heroic counterintelligence work or dramatic captures. It is about the deeper truth of Cold War espionage, that beneath the grand ideological confrontation between superpowers, beneath the nuclear standoffs and diplomatic crises, there existed a vast, shadowy world of ordinary-looking men engaged in patient deception. Ernst Bauer's clock shop represented the perfect expression of this truth, a business that existed solely to support a lie, a storefront that generated genuine income while concealing an operation decades in the making, a routine so carefully maintained that it took 13 years and a random administrative audit to reveal the fiction beneath. The clocks in that shop kept perfect time, their mechanisms precise and reliable, while the men who repaired them lived according to a different chronology, entirely a calendar measured not in hours and minutes, but in the long, patient accumulation of secrets. And when the operation finally collapsed, when the FBI teams entered at dawn, and the arrests were made, and the evidence was catalogued, those clocks continued ticking in their display windows, marking time with mechanical indifference, as if nothing at all had changed.